Today I want to continue the series I've started about domains and evolution in Burgundy by talking about an estate that's particularly close to my heart. It's Domaine, Coche, Dury and Lachaux. Now, it's not particularly original to be a great admirer of this family's wines, but I think like many Burgundy lovers, they've been a very important influence on my personal understanding of white Burgundy, and I've had innumerable number of great bottles from this estate. I spent much of my vacations as a student ravaging the wine lists of provincial France for keenly priced bottles of Coche Dury. So Raphael Coche took over from his father Jean-François officially with the 2010 vintage, and in fact he'd been working full-time at the Domaine since the late 1990s. But it was only really in the 2012, 13, 14 vintages that people started to perceive and talk about a stylistic change at the Domaine. And it's a very discreet family. Getting an appointment to taste at Coche Dury is probably harder than getting one at Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, and they're not much given to publicity, so there's been a lot of speculation about exactly what's happened, and I've taken the opportunity to talk to Raphael and his father about the evolution. And in fact, of course, the style of any domain is in fact an ensemble of many small critical decisions and details, and it's hard to think of a family that pays more attention to detail than the Coche family. But what's changed has really not been of huge significance. So Raphael has slightly reduced the percentage of new oak, especially for the regional and communal appellations. It does a bit less batonnage, and I think perhaps a little bit more débourbage, so settling of the must before fermentation. And what people talk about when they say that the style has changed, and I think I perceived it, especially in the 13 vintage, is the absence of what is often called Coche reduction. But I have an issue with that expression, really, because I think people often conflate varietal character, the aromatic influence of some very particular oak barrels, and then long élevage with reduction. Of course, all of those things can coexist, but if you look at the last 20 vintages of Coche, the only notably reductive vintages were, in fact, 2007 and 1999, to a lesser extent 2004. And none of those wines actually have a kind of intense reduction, bound-in reduction you find in, I think the worst example I can think of is the 2004 Le Fleuve Pucelle, which has a sort of decaying skunk aromatics. There's absolutely none of that in the Coche wines. And looking further back at some of Jean-François' greatest vintages, 1989, 1990, 2005, reduction really wasn't an important part of the aromatic signatures of the wines. That sort of nutty, toasty, smoky characteristics don't necessarily come from reduction. And indeed, from my perspective, especially tasting recent releases from Raphael, which I think are performing brilliantly, and then looking at how the 13s and the 14s, especially again the regional appellations, where that sort of oak influence initial impact was probably the most keenly missed for those nostalgic like me for the old style of the Domaine. Those wines are also evolving in an extremely positive direction and definitely rank among some of the high points of those vintages. And I'd also like to add that I think that this family is one of the few I can really think of in Burgundy where generational change has been a cumulative process. So each generation, starting with Léon Coche, who founded the Domaine in the 1920s with his war pension, onto Georges and Jean-François and Raphael, each generation has had a great reverence for what came before, has brought their own elements to the equation, refining the style, expanding the holdings, improving the quality of the holdings, investing in viticulture and material in the cellar. And in fact, I'm immensely optimistic about this estate's future, about the evolution of the wines, and even if they're extremely expensive on the secondary market and very hard to find, they remain an absolute pinnacle of white Burgundy and personal reference points for me.